And maybe you can also weigh in on this, Thulas, the type of conversations that would have needed to be had in the last couple of days between the government and Mugabe's family. We saw Leo Mugabe, the family spokesperson, coming out to speak about the portrayal, saying that Mugabe died a wounded man. You know, he wanted an apology that he probably never even got. And he's saying that, almost uncertain of whether or not Mugabe really got that apology from Emmerson Mnangagwa or not. And I suppose now the only person who would really know is the person closest to him, Grace Mugabe. So keeping in mind that the kind of personality and character that Grace Mugabe is, and the portrayal that came from Emmerson Mnangagwa, what would have been some of those conversations that were taking place this week?
It can't have been an easy conversation, as you pose it, Lindy. Jamie, because what Lindy is talking about, the dynamic partly also of Emmerson Mnangagwa and Grace Mugabe, because in the last few months before the coup in 2017, whether you call it a coup or not, because the preferred name for it in Zimbabwe, certainly in official circles, is a military intervention, a military-assisted transition, but it was a coup.
That's what they like to call the coup.
It was a coup. And so in the months before that happened, the tensions rose between the two. Many people draw a line, Lindy, between the sort of fast-tracking of the demise of Robert Mugabe and the interventions and the attempts to sort of push Grace Mugabe to ascend in the dynasty that you talk about, Jamie. And so the tension between the two of them, I would say, I don't know how much tension was there between Robert Mugabe and Emmerson Mnangagwa, but it seemed to me that certainly the tension was higher between Emmerson Mnangagwa and Grace Mugabe, the animosity. And it had to be, because they were now competitors to ascend and actually succeed him.
Yeah, I mean, put it briefly, they had beef. They had real beef. And you can tell from the messaging around people who are within the G40 faction, because Grace Mugabe has not spoken, but the people who are in her faction trying to get this transition. We've got Leo Mugabe, we've got Patrick Joao, you've also got Jonathan Moyo, the professor, who even right now on social media are making it very clear. One, there was a coup. Two, that they view that the treatment that Robert Mugabe received at the hands of Emmerson Mnangagwa and the army was unjust, undue, and violated his dignity. So all of this narrative around that Mugabe didn't want to be buried by this man is a factional dispute within the ZANU-PF. And it matters only in the assessment of how strong is Emmerson Mnangagwa within his own ranks. Because you must remember, as we're analyzing Zimbabwe, at the beginning of the year, there were protests. These protests were shut down violently. The internet was shut down. There have been repressions of protests. The MDC tried to protest a few weeks ago. They were banned for spurious reasons. So he's not in a comfortable position. This new currency that they've reintroduced has flopped. His economic reforms have not materialized. And he's also economically wounded. There are power outages. There's massive unemployment. Doctors have been on strike. This is the lived condition of the Zimbabwean people. So this moment of Mugabe's death and all of the political drama that ensues, right, brings to sharp contrast the man Mnangagwa himself. So what he has tried to do is to position himself central to the Mugabe legacy, re-embrace him. But what the Mugabe family said was not so fast. You're not going to re-embrace this man and make it seem as if you are the rightful, successor to him. You are a pretender to the throne, so to speak. And this is the challenge. So in delaying the funeral and saying maybe even that delayed burial will be open to the public, what they're actually doing is dividing the ZANU-PF along this line of G40 and G40 sympathetic people and hardliners of Mnangagwa.
We are seeing in picture there the arrival of the former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo. I also saw a few minutes ago our international relations minister, Naledi Pandor, also there in the mix there, among the people who have arrived there. Of course, earlier on, we did see former President Thabo Mbeki also arriving. In fact, the announcement is being made at the moment. Festus Mogae among those who have arrived. Interestingly though, Jamie, among the people that I did see there is Lovemore Maduku, Atam Tambara.
Yeah.
This talks to a particular era in Zimbabwe, right? Because this is the period, these two gentlemen, I think, are part of the cohort that represents that period before the formation of the MDC in 1998. The confluence between academia and student movement, because Atam Tambara came from, and we see former President Jacob Zuma there arriving at the stadium as well. So it would seem, though, as Hitekani was talking about, you don't speak ill of the dead. Seeing Atam Tambara, I'm not surprised, but Love Momaduku is kind of a different story, because there's a particular story around civil society and how Mugabe viewed civil society as being sponsored by the West, and Love Momaduku was arguably the personification of that.
Absolutely. Love Momaduku is a constitutional expert. He has written quite extensively on constitutional issues in Zimbabwe. And when he was seeking constitutional amendments, Mugabe basically had him thrashed multiple times. He had so many broken bones from the Mugabe regime throughout the 90s and the 2000s. It's actually rather surprising how close he has ingratiated himself to the Mugabe family in this moment. Some people have said maybe there are financial reasons.
Because it's Love Momaduku.
Yes, legitimacy reasons that he always finds himself close to, in the short to medium term, everyone has got bills to pay. But aside from that, when we look at his engagement, even Tambara's engagement, it does speak to how Mugabe governed the state, because student movements have always been critical to raising voices of dissent. We've seen that even in China, we've seen that in Sudan, and we've seen it in South Africa as well. And Mugabe's response to Mtambara was one of intimidation, because Mtambara spoke up in the late 80s. He said, this guy is power hungry, he's created a one-party state, we don't want that. And he was repressed.
And let's also maybe speak about the relationship that South Africa's presidents had with Mugabe. We're seeing the former President Jacob Zuma on the podium greeting President Emmerson Mnangagwa and his wife there. We do know that the ANC often clashed with Robert Mugabe, and they also released a statement saying that they've praised him as the long-standing friend, but also said that the history would decide whether or not his legacy is good or bad.
Yeah, the ANC, I find them to be a little bit complicit, and this is the tough conversation we don't want to have in South Africa, because we've had the elephant in the room of the xenophobic attacks over the last few weeks, and most of the mass migration into South Africa has come from Zimbabwe. So because of the liberation heritage that exists in this community, where people were like, Mugabe held back on land, he allowed the South African independence plane to land, and they view him from that view that he was a great African liberator. But when they are now taken to task about what about him as a governor, as a head of state, then the conversations get very slippery. We blame the IMF, we blame Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher, Lancaster House agreements being reneged upon, and we don't examine the man of Robert Mugabe from that land. So there were opportunities that South Africa had, specifically in 2002 and in 2008. In 2002, the Kampepe report revealed that there were gross irregularities in that particular election. But Thabo Mbeki made a strategic decision to sideline that report, to keep it under the wraps so that he could try to give Mugabe, almost a second chance to reboot his regime. What did Mugabe do? He doubled down on being Mugabe, brutalizing his people, bad economic policies. And what happened? You must understand, you remember the earlier footage where people were saying they're scared to speak on TV because they're scared of reprisals. That is a common feature of, criticizing the Zimbabwean government. Even as I do this robust criticism, it doesn't come without consequences, right? So what you see is that a lot of people made an assessment. I can't speak up against this man, I will get killed. I can't vote against this man, he will rig. I am hungry, I'm starving, I have no future here. Those who could leave with degrees did so. Those who could leave, under student status did so. Many people said, I'm poor, I'm destitute, I'm just going to cross the border and see what future has for me.
So while you're talking about the role of South Africa there, I'm thinking about the mediation that was undertaken by the various, in fact, we're seeing the procession, the cortege, making its way. Those are live visuals from Harare. The casket now placed inside that vehicle, that military vehicle. You remember when the body arrived in Harare on Wednesday, there was a situation where that transparent glass trailer basically arrived at the airport, but for some reason the casket wasn't placed there as many would have expected. But we are seeing that at this moment, the casket being ushered into the National Sports Stadium in Harare. So we're going to stay with those visuals for just a moment and allow you to take it in. You can hear already the cheering from inside the stadium as people are seeing on the big screens that are inside the National Sports Stadium that they are now seeing the casket making its way into the stadium. Various military wings is standing at attention inside there on the pitch. This is a scene that played itself over and over again over the years. These are the men and women that Robert Mugabe would inspect every year on the 18th of April to mark independence. Today they are there to pay their last respects to the man who was their commander-in-chief for decades.
And I mean, Tulas, the news of his death has evoked many emotions for different people. As we spoke earlier on, he's been described as a man of many contradictions. Some experience what can only be described as, what can only be described as contradictions, like I said. And as can be expected, for Mugabe's relatives and friends, his death robbed them of a hero, a Pan-Africanist, a liberator, while for those who witnessed and experienced his violence and even oppression, Tulas, especially for, like we said earlier on, the Ndebele-speaking people of Zimbabwe, they say goodbye to a man who brought them anguish. I mean, this is a man who refused to apologize for killing more than 20,000 innocent Ndebele civilians years ago. And, everyone has agreed that that was wrong, but no one has been held to account for those deaths.
In fact, Lindy, as you say that, the late former President Robert Mugabe described it as a moment of madness by all. And my immediate retort to this has always been, well, the people who died were not mad, were certainly not mad. They were killed by someone. And it seems to me that that is a chapter that Zimbabweans are unlikely to ever get closure for and justice for. But actually, before we saw the casket, Jamie, I was asking you because we saw former President Jacob Zuma and former President Thabo Mbeki, both there. They shook hands, actually, just a few minutes ago. Yeah. Both of these men had the opportunity to play the role of mediator. Yeah. And both of them have different kind of relationships, historic, with the late former President Robert Mugabe. To what extent do you think they were disempowered by the burden of their historical relationship with him, or perhaps outsmarted by Robert Mugabe in the way that were they able to corner him to make certain concessions at various points during their mediation?
Look, I think the whole of SADC definitely failed the people of Zimbabwe, because you always have to look at this from the perspective of the man on the ground. Even the people who are praising him, they are working at a bus station in Braamfontein, That's probably not what they envisioned for themselves. But I think that it was a combination of factors. One, Mugabe was a stubborn leader, and he understood the principles of sovereignty, and he did use the principles of sovereignty to defend himself on the international stage from, being influenced unduly, as he would put it. But secondarily, I do think that the ANC tradition has been that they take a side with the ZANU-PF. They take a side with whatever African state they view. I think Libya was perhaps one of the few exceptions where they went a little bit beyond what everyone thought they would do. But because of the unique relationship that South Africa has with Zimbabwe, and many people may not know this because we do call that tribe Ndebele, right? But Ndebele is a cluster of tribes. Predominantly Zulus are in that contingent. under Mzilikazi in the late 1800s, I believe. They fled from Shaka when there was a confrontation and then settled in Gwabulawayo in Zimbabwe. But they maintained their Zulu identity. They were misnamed by a historian. So even the relationship between South Africa and Zimbabwe is tighter than people would anticipate. Having said that, South Africa and Zimbabwe are very intertwined economically. We supply power to Zimbabwe. There's a lot of trade between South Africa and Zimbabwe, even before there was an economic collapse. But when there was an economic collapse, Zimbabwe was leaning very heavily on South Africa. And I think at that point, that was when Thabo Mbeki and subsequently Jacob Zuma could have used their influence to say, listen, you are my big brother, but right now I'm supporting you. I have to take care of your people. I have to give you electricity. I have to borrow you money. What's the problem? You're suppressing your people. You're repressing them. Give them some of the reforms that they want. Make sure that this particular economic transition that you're pursuing is not done in this haphazard way that you're doing it. There's nothing wrong in principle with seeking land reform for your people. There's everything wrong with doing it in a manner that ignores rule of law, that is haphazard, that benefits only a few, and one that doesn't take into consideration the nature of global finance. All of the things that which Mugabe did economically, whilst repressing and oppressing his people. Even during that period, there was an operation called Operation Mrambatswina. Basically, Mugabe said, all of these informal traders in Harare, I don't want to see them. They must go back to the rural areas, get rid of them. And these people were beaten, they were harassed, they were put into police vans, and they were taken out of the city. It was so repressive, and it's well documented. And even in those instances, South Africa didn't give the call and say, Mugabe, we don't do that to our own civilians. You know, you may have an issue with informal traders, but maybe we can show you how we deal with this in an ethical manner, one that doesn't
And
target
it wasn't
the
just
poor.
informal traders, there were also people's homes,
Yes.
what were considered shanties.
Exactly.
Structures that perhaps aesthetically were not desirable to the state, that you shouldn't have these structures. These were people's homes.
Exactly.
But, you know, in the eyes of the state, they were
Yes.
shanties and had to be destroyed. The graders moved in, and I've heard horrible tales. I know of a friend of mine, and I've told the story before, whose wife was pregnant, and basically there was no warning that this was going to happen, and she was in the house, and the graders moved in, and when the demolition started, she went into shock and actually lost the baby. That's a scar for that family, and they're not the only ones with that kind of a scar.
Absolutely. Those stories abound. I mean, my father died in a hospital. He went in, and there were no doctors on the day, and basically he died in the queue.